Why did cowboys ride 32 miles every day on the trail? The dust never settled on the Chisholm Trail. It rose in thick, choking clouds from the hooves of thousands of longhorn cattle, coating the skin, filling the lungs, and stinging the eyes of every man who dared push a herd northward across the American frontier. These were not romantic figures galloping freely across open prairies for the thrill of it. They were working men, underpaid, sunburned, perpetually exhausted, locked into one of the most physically demanding occupations the 19th century ever produced. And every single day, regardless of weather, injury, or morale, they were expected to cover roughly 32 miles of unforgiving terrain before the sun disappeared behind the horizon. Not 30, not 40, 32. That number was not arbitrary, and the story behind it stretches far deeper than most people ever bother to look. To understand why 32 miles became the standard measure of a good day's drive, you have to first understand what a cattle drive actually was at its core. It was not simply moving animals from one place to another. It was a logistical operation of staggering complexity, governed by the biology of the cattle themselves, the geography of the land, the economics of the beef market, and the razor-thin margin between profit and catastrophe. Every decision a trail boss made, from the pace of the morning push to the choice of a river crossing, had financial consequences that could ripple all the way back to a rancher sitting in a Texas office weeks behind the herd. The 32-mile figure was the result of decades of hard-won experience, of drives that failed because they moved too fast, and drives that collapsed because they moved too slow. It was the number the land itself seemed to demand. The cattle trail era in America lasted roughly 20 years, from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to the mid-1880s, when barbed wire, railroad expansion, and the catastrophic winters of 1886 and 1887 effectively ended the open range. But during those 2 decades, somewhere between 5 and 10 million longhorn cattle were driven north from Texas to railheads in Kansas, Nebraska, and beyond. The longhorn was the ideal animal for this kind of work. Hardy, ornery, capable of surviving on sparse grass and little water, and possessed of legs built for distance. A longhorn steer could walk 1,500 miles and arrive at the railhead in better condition than most other breeds would have managed after 500. But even the longhorn had limits, and those limits dictated everything about how a drive was conducted. A healthy longhorn needed to graze for roughly 12 hours out of every 24. It needed water at regular intervals, typically every day or every other day at most, depending on the season. It needed to sleep, to rest its muscles, and to maintain enough body weight that when it finally stepped onto the scale at the stockyards in Abilene or Dodge City, it fetched a price worth the months of effort required to get it there. A steer that arrived gaunt and ragged was worth significantly less than one that arrived fat and strong. This meant the trail boss was constantly managing a tension between speed and preservation, pushing the herd fast enough to reach the railhead before the summer heat peaked or the autumn cold set in, while keeping the cattle well fed enough to be worth selling. 32 miles per day, spread across a long enough grazing day, was the number that most experienced trail bosses found threaded that needle with reliable consistency. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Whether you're in Texas, up in Montana, or somewhere completely unexpected, we want to know. This history belongs to all of us, and we read every single comment. The mathematics of the trail were unforgiving. A typical herd on a long drive consisted of between 1,000 and 3,000 head of cattle, though some of the larger drives pushed as many as 5,000 animals north at once. Moving that many living creatures across open land required a precise choreography. At the front of the herd, 2 or 3 of the most experienced cowboys, called the point men, guided the lead steers. Behind them, swing riders on each flank kept the herd from spreading too wide. Further back, flank riders prevented stragglers from drifting. And at the rear, choking on the worst of the dust, rode the drag riders, usually the youngest and least experienced cowboys, whose job was to keep the slow and the weak moving forward through a combination of shouting, rope slapping, and sheer stubborn persistence. A herd strung out across 3 miles of trail, moving at a pace of roughly 1.5 miles per hour through the cooler morning hours, could cover 12 to 15 miles before the midday heat made further movement impractical. The cattle would then be allowed to spread out, graze and rest through the hottest part of the afternoon. In the late afternoon, as temperatures dropped, the drive would resume, pushing another 10 to 17 miles before the herd was bedded down for the night on whatever ground the trail boss judged suitable, ideally near water, ideally on ground firm enough not to mire in rain, and ideally far enough from any timber that a spooked herd wouldn't disappear into the trees. Add the morning push and the afternoon push together, and 32 miles emerges not as an arbitrary target, but as a natural consequence of cattle biology intersecting with the rhythms of a Texas summer day. The cowboys themselves were a different kind of calculation. The average trail crew consisted of one trail boss, a cook, a wrangler responsible for the remuda, the spare horses, and between 8 and 12 cowboys for every 1,000 head of cattle. A drive of 2,000 longhorns might employ 15 men in total, including the boss and cook. Their wages were modest by any measure. A working cowboy in the 1870s earned between $25 and $40 a month, with the trail boss taking perhaps 75 to 100. These were not wealthy men chasing adventure. They were laborers in one of the most physically brutal industries the American West ever produced, and they understood the 32-mile daily standard not as a romantic achievement, but as a professional obligation, the baseline performance required to keep a job. The remuda was as important to the daily mileage as the cattle themselves. Each cowboy on a drive required between 5 and 8 horses to sustain the pace of a long trail. No single horse could work a full day pushing cattle without breaking down, and the demands on a good cutting horse or a reliable night horse were immense. The wrangler kept the remuda together and ensured that fresh horses were available for every shift. A cowboy with a good string of horses could cover his 32 miles with something approaching confidence. A cowboy whose horses went lame in the middle of Indian Territory had problems that no amount of determination could solve quickly. The relationship between a cowboy and his horses was not sentimental. It was purely functional, purely economic, and absolutely essential to survival on the trail. Water sources dictated the geometry of the drives far more than most people realize. The great cattle trails, the Chisholm Trail, the Western Trail, the Goodnight Loving Trail, the Shawnee Trail, were not random paths scratched across the map by wandering cowboys. They were engineered routes, refined over years of use, that threaded together reliable water sources at intervals a longhorn herd could reasonably travel. When water was scarce crossing the arid stretches of West Texas or the dry flats of Indian Territory, a trail boss might push the herd harder, covering 40 miles in a day to reach the next water before the cattle began to suffer. When water was abundant, he might slow the pace, banking condition against the hard stretches ahead. The river crossings were among the most dangerous moments of any drive. The Red River, the Cimarron, the Arkansas, each one had its own temperament, its own hidden dangers. A river running clear and low in early spring could become a roiling torrent after a week of rains upstream, and a trail boss had no reliable way of knowing what waited until he rode down to the bank himself. Crossing 2,000 longhorns across a flooded river was a feat of controlled chaos. Cowboys shouting, horses swimming, cattle milling in panicked circles. Men drowned in these crossings. Whole days were lost waiting for water to drop, and those lost days compressed the remaining schedule, putting enormous pressure on every subsequent push. The night watch was another dimension of the daily labor that rarely appears in popular accounts of the trail. Every night, for the entire duration of a drive that might last 3 or 4 months, cowboys stood watch over the sleeping herd in shifts of 2 to 3 hours. 2 riders would circle the bedded cattle slowly, singing softly, not for any romantic reason, but because the sound of a human voice, continuous and calm, seemed to keep the cattle from startling. Longhorns were notoriously prone to stampedes, and a stampede at night was one of the most terrifying and costly events a drive could experience. A herd of 2,000 cattle running blind through darkness could scatter across 10 miles of territory, and rounding them up again might cost 2 or 3 days. Days that meant money, days that could turn a profitable drive into a marginal one. Stampedes could be triggered by almost anything: a coyote's howl, a bolt of lightning, a tumbleweed rolling into the herd's sleeping ground. Once the first animal lurched to its feet in panic, the reaction spread through the herd in seconds. The cowboy's response was to ride alongside the stampeding mass and gradually turn the lead animals in a wide arc, bending the stampede back on itself until the herd ran in a circle, a mill that slowed and eventually stopped. This maneuver required tremendous horsemanship, extraordinary nerve, and a willingness to gallop at full speed in near total darkness, inches from thousands of horns and hooves. Cowboys died doing it, and yet it was simply part of the job, as ordinary and expected as saddling up at dawn. Hey, we want to hear from you. If you've made it this far into the video, you're clearly someone who loves real history. What's the most surprising thing you've learned so far? Leave it in the comments. We genuinely love reading what stands out to different people, and your comment might just inspire the next video. The economics that drove the cattle trail era into existence were born from the specific disruption of the Civil War. Before the war, Texas had a modest beef industry that served local markets, but during 4 years of conflict, Texas ranchers continued to breed cattle while the market essentially collapsed. By 1865, Texas was overflowing with longhorns. Conservative estimates suggest 5 million roamed the range at war's end, many of them unbranded strays that belonged to whoever could catch them. Meanwhile, the industrial cities of the Northeast were desperately short of protein, and the price of beef in Chicago or New York was several times what it was in San Antonio. A steer worth $3 or $4 in Texas could fetch $40 in Kansas City. The cattle trail era was born from that price differential. It was an arbitrage opportunity measured in hooves and miles. Joseph McCoy, an Illinois livestock dealer, understood this opportunity with unusual clarity. In 1867, he established a proper stockyard at Abilene, Kansas, where the Kansas Pacific Railroad had recently laid track, and sent word south into Texas that he would buy cattle at fair prices. The Chisholm Trail, a route already roughed out by trader Jesse Chisholm along an old trading path, became the spine of a new industry almost overnight. In its peak years, the trail carried more than 500,000 cattle per season northward through Indian Territory and into Kansas. The trail itself was worn 10 to 12 feet deep in places by the passage of so many hooves, a physical scar on the landscape that can still be traced in certain parts of Oklahoma today. The trail bosses who made these drives successful were remarkable men in ways that history has not always recognized. They were not simply tough men on horses. They were logisticians, meteorologists, negotiators, veterinarians, and commanders of small armies of independent-minded laborers, all rolled into one leather-faced, squint-eyed package. A good trail boss needed to know every river crossing, every reliable spring, every patch of good grass, every section of soft ground that would mire a herd after rain. He needed to negotiate with ranching syndicates, with the Native American nations whose territory the trail crossed, and with Kansas farmers whose crops sometimes lay directly in the path of a moving herd. He was a one-man institution in a landscape without institutions. Charles Goodnight was perhaps the most sophisticated trail boss the era produced. With his partner Oliver Loving, Goodnight pioneered the trail that bears their names. swinging west from Texas through New Mexico and Colorado, tapping the lucrative military and mining markets of the Mountain West. Goodnight was responsible for one of the most important innovations of the cattle drive, the chuck wagon. Before his modification of a standard army wagon, reinforced bed, hinged lid forming a work surface, storage compartments for supplies, cowboys ate whatever they could carry individually. The chuck wagon transformed drive logistics by centralizing food preparation and giving the cook a mobile kitchen that arrived at camp ahead of the herd, a hot meal, always waiting. The cook held a position of authority on a cattle drive, second only to the trail boss. He controlled the food, the coffee, and the medicine chest, and was often the closest thing to a doctor the crew would see for months, responsible for treating everything from snake bites to broken bones to the dysentery that periodically swept through a crew drinking from questionable water sources. Cowboys who antagonized the cook did so at considerable peril. His authority over the area around the chuck wagon was absolute, and no trail boss would contradict him on his own ground. We're curious, how did you find this video? Did someone recommend it, or did it come up in your feed? Let us know in the comments, and while you're there, tell us if there's a specific part of cowboy history you'd love us to cover next. Your suggestions actually shape what we make. The Indian Territory presented challenges that tested every trail boss who pushed cattle north through what is now Oklahoma. The 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, had developed their own cattle ranching economies and held treaty rights that included charging tolls for herds crossing their land, typically 10 cents per head, amounting to $200 on a herd of 2,000. Trail bosses who attempted to avoid paying faced having their herds turned back at gunpoint. The relationship between the cattle drives and the Plains tribes beyond Indian Territory was more complex and more violent. The Comanche and Kiowa had developed a sophisticated raiding economy that included taking horses and cattle from passing trail drives. Some trail bosses paid tribute, offering cattle to war leaders in exchange for safe passage. Others hired additional armed riders. The reality of the trail was that violence was always possible and always nearby. The physical toll on the cowboys was extraordinary by any standard. A cowboy on a long drive slept on the ground, changed his clothes rarely if at all, ate a diet heavy in beans, salt pork, and sourdough biscuits, and worked between 15 and 18 hours on active days. In rain, he worked in rain. In heat that reached 110 degrees on the southern stretches of the trail, he kept moving. In the dark of a plains thunderstorm, with lightning striking close enough to feel, and the herd beginning to shift in collective anxiety, he circled the cattle and sang, because that was his job, and there was no one else to do it. The weather on the Great Plains was a recurring antagonist. The same sky that could produce spectacular sunsets visible for 50 miles could also build a tornado with less than an hour's warning, or drop 6 inches of hail on a herd before a cowboy could pull on an extra layer. Blue northers, the sudden cold fronts sweeping down from Canada across the unprotected prairie, could drop temperatures by 40 degrees in an hour, turning a comfortable October afternoon into a survival situation. Trail bosses learned to read the sky with the same attention a sailor gives the sea, watching for the particular shade of green at the base of a developing thunderstorm, for the wind shifts that preceded a norther, for the haze on the southern horizon that meant dry lightning drifting north. The railheads themselves, Abilene, Ellsworth, Wichita, Dodge City, were the destination and the release valve of every drive. When a trail crew arrived after 3 months on the trail, the transition from controlled discipline to the unrestricted chaos of a cattle town was immediate and often spectacular. Cowboys who had earned $40 a month for 3 months suddenly had $120 in their pockets. The saloons, gambling houses, and establishments surrounding every railhead were precisely engineered to relieve those cowboys of their money as efficiently as possible. Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and the other lawmen of the Kansas cattle towns were employed specifically to manage the controlled explosion of energy that accompanied every trail crew's arrival and keep the violence from becoming commercially inconvenient. All right, pause for just a second. If this video has been worth your time, the single best thing you can do right now is hit that like button. It genuinely changes how many people see this content, and it tells us that you want more history like this. Now back to the story. The end of the cattle trail era arrived not dramatically, but through the accumulation of pressures that made the long drive obsolete. Barbed wire, invented in 1874 by Joseph Glidden, was the most immediate cause. By the late 1870s, Kansas and Nebraska farmers were stringing wire across the open range, blocking traditional trail routes. The wire was cheap, effective, and unstoppable. A single man could fence a mile of range in a day, and there were thousands of homesteaders arriving every month, each of them shrinking the open corridor through which the drives had to pass. The railroads extended their reach into Texas during the 1880s, making it unnecessary to drive cattle north at all. When lines reached San Antonio and Fort Worth, ranchers could load their cattle directly onto rail cars and ship them north without the expense and weight loss associated with a 3-month trail drive. The economics that had made the trail necessary collapsed as transportation costs dropped. The terrible winters of 1886 and 1887 delivered the final blow. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was the worst in recorded memory on the northern plains. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and stayed there for weeks. Blizzards buried range grass under 6 feet of snow, and cattle by the hundreds of thousands died huddled against fences. Some ranchers lost 80% of their herds in a single winter. The great cattle syndicates that had made fortunes running cattle on the open range were bankrupted overnight, their capital lying dead and stiff across 10 million acres of Montana and Wyoming grassland. The era of the open range, and with it, the era of the long trail drive, was over. What remained was the mythology, remarkably durable enough to shape the self-image of an entire nation and inspire more novels, films, and television series than almost any other American historical experience. The cowboy of Hollywood bears approximately the same relationship to the working cowboy of the 1870s that a tournament night bears to medieval warfare. Both contain genuine elements of the original, and both have been polished until the grit, the boredom, and the sheer physical misery have been largely erased. The real cowboy was often young. The average age on a trail crew was around 24. He was frequently broke, frequently in debt to the ranching company he worked for, and he was statistically likely to be African American or Mexican. Historians estimate that between a quarter and a third of all trail cowboys were black or Hispanic, a demographic reality the mythology almost entirely erased, and that only recent scholarship has begun to restore to its proper prominence. You've been watching this entire time, and that means something. Right now, go ahead and subscribe if you haven't. Not because of an algorithm, but because this kind of history deserves an audience that actually cares. And if someone you know would genuinely enjoy this, share it with them directly. That's the most powerful thing you can do for this channel. The legacy of the cattle drive era embedded itself in the American landscape in ways both visible and invisible. The Chisholm Trail left physical marks. The deep-worn paths in Oklahoma, the river crossings whose banks were widened by millions of hooves, the cattle towns whose layouts still reflect the original placement of stockyards relative to the rail line. The vocabulary of American English absorbed dozens of terms from the cattle industry: roundup, stampede, maverick, wrangler, lasso, bronco. Most of them ultimately derived from the Spanish and vaquero traditions that Anglo cowboys adopted wholesale. The cultural identity of the Great Plains states, the economic structures of the Western beef industry, the patterns of land ownership in Texas and Oklahoma, all bear the fingerprints of those 20 years when millions of longhorns walked north and changed everything they touched. That number, 32 miles, is a kind of key that unlocks everything about the cattle drive era. It unlocks the biology of the longhorn and the geography of the trail. It unlocks the economics of the beef market and the logistics of the chuck wagon. It unlocks the authority of the trail boss and the desperate calculation of the rancher waiting back in Texas for word of how his herd had sold. The trail bosses who enforced that standard, the cowboys who covered those miles day after day, regardless of weather or exhaustion, and the longhorns whose legs made it all possible, were participants in an experiment the American West could only sustain for a generation before the conditions that made it possible vanished. What they built was not permanent, but it was real. As real as the dust that never settled on the Chisholm Trail, as real as the boots worn through on the hard ground between Texas and Kansas, as real as the names carved into the wood of a Kansas railhead by men who had walked 1,000 miles to get there and wanted, in some small way, to prove they had.